My interpretation of the Voynich manuscript, as far as it goes, is based on two identifications. First, I identify the region depicted in the rosette folio, the Voynich map, as alpine northern Italy, and specifically the region centred on the Rosengarten mountains in the Dolomites. Second, I identify the nymphs, conspicuous in the manuscript, as depictions of the Gannes, the healing water nymphs of the Fanes sagas, from the myths and legends of the Ladin speakers, resident in the valleys of those same mountains. I think both of these identifications are clear and not difficult, and are consistent with other evidence and expert opinion which places the work in alpine northern Italy in the first half of the 1400s. Moreover, and most importantly, the Ladin people have a well-known, rich and ancient tradition of herbal medicine. If we ask which herbal tradition is depicted in this medieval book, the answer is the herbal tradition native to alpine northern Italy, the herbalism of the Ladin. The map of Ladin mountainous regions and the nymphs from Ladin legend confirm this to my mind. The identifications need to be argued in detail, of course, but I'm confident that they can be. And in fact, I think the identification is surprisingly obvious, all things considered. The reasoning goes: this arcane herbal seems to be from Renaissance northern Italy, witness the architecture in the map. Expert opinion has suspected so from the outset, with some specifying alpine northern Italy, witness alpine herbs and mountain topography. Is there an arcane herbal tradition to be found in alpine northern Italy? Yes, there is. The Ladin people have an ancient local herb tradition. Recent ethnobotanical studies suggest it is very ancient and stress the unique nature of its botany. Would that explain the nymphs as well as the herbs? Yes, it would. The Ladin have a tradition that features healing water nymphs who populate the rivers, streams, waterfalls, lakes, pools, ponds and mineral springs of their mountain landscape. When we follow this line of investigation, it soon becomes clear that this is what we have in the Voynich manuscript: some account or record of the herbal traditions of the Ladin people, who have lived in the remote valleys of the Dolomites since ancient Roman times. The key to both identifications is to understand the phenomenon of Alpenglow, which famously lights up the peaks of the Rosengarten mountains. This is why those mountains are depicted as candle flame-shaped spires in the map, and why, as per tradition, the water nymphs of that landscape are depicted as golden-haired and rosy-cheeked. Another key is to appreciate that the Ladin herbal tradition includes a tradition of healing waters. Herbs and water are healing agents in the Ladin tradition, with the nymphs, Gannes, able to heal through water alone, that is, through mineral waters. A further key is to appreciate that the Ladin were herb gatherers. Much of the Voynich manuscript, I posit, concerns where and when to harvest herbs, as well as the where and when of the mountain hydrology, the cycles of which are shown being controlled by the nymphs. The work is not the herbal of an urban physician or an apothecary, and it does not address particular diseases. It is the herbal of herb gatherers. It concerns where herbs are to be found and in what seasons and under what stars. Hence the map, the meteorology and the star-based chronometers. This distinction, a herb gatherer rather than a herbalist, is very important in order to understand the work correctly. The Ladin were, or are, herb gatherers, not herb growers, and not herbalists in the urban shopkeeper sense. As a general framework, the work depicts a mountain cosmology, including a mountain astronomy, which is inherently different to an astronomy formulated on open plains, by the way, and accounts of the cycles of seasons and weather within an alpine microcosm. Within this frame, I think we can give a coherent general reading of the manuscript from the illustrations alone. The pharmacological section concerns the preservation of herbs and the production of what I call mountain tonics, made by the traditional water extraction method and mode of sympathetic magic known today as percolation. Given these identifications, the linguistic background to the work should be, I believe, Ladin, perhaps with material collected in its several dialects. Certainly Ladin, a Rhaeto-Romance remnant of ancient Vulgar Latin, is the language of that region and that mythology. It is the language that matches the pictures. Indeed, it is the only language that matches the pictures. The relevant nymph mythology is Ladin myth of the Ladin people in the Ladin language. If the underlying language is not Ladin, then it is a language being used to record or describe places and traditions native to the Ladin people, the most likely being in that case German or Italian. If Voynich Ms is a code or an encryption, then it is an encryption of material concerning Ladin traditions, and we need to supply a reason it has been encrypted. The simplest explanation would be that herb gatherers, as much as gold prospectors, have their secrets, although there may be many reasons why such a work would be made so that only certain people could read it. It is less likely that it is an artificial language made for the purpose, but it is not out of the question because, quite evidently, an artificial alphabet and set of characters and glyphs has been made for the purpose. I suspect that the author thinks, not unreasonably, that Ladin preserves ancient Latin, and so the author has an interest in the humanist script, believing it to be the ancient style restored, and thus an appropriate vehicle for rendering Ladin. That would explain the so-called humanist hand. I suppose the author considered existing scripts inappropriate or inadequate for the task he faced. A Ladin speaker might have a natural interest in the humanist project to restore the ancient Latin script and shared their mistaken belief that Carolingian minuscule was ancient Latin in its purity. But, and it is a big but, the textual evidence tells us that the transition from a plain text to Voynich Ms has not been straightforward, whatever the underlying language. The language revealed in the manuscript is a highly artificial construction, for whatever reason. It is clearly not a simple matter of someone mapping spoken Ladin into script in an uncomplicated way. Nevertheless, I think it is likely, but admittedly unproven, that the peculiarities of the Voynich text are the result of linguistic rather than cryptological processes, and specifically the challenge of rendering the oral traditions of Ladin, its meaning, textures and above all sounds, to writing for the first time, with no established conventions for doing so, and this done not by a linguist, but by a herbalist, or herb gatherer, whose linguistic skills are probably as adept as his drawing skills. Ladin was unwritten. It was an entirely oral heritage and very localised. The first official record of any Ladin being written down is not until the 1690s. The first book in Ladin did not appear until the 19th century. The Ladin sagas were unwritten until the early 20th century. Even today, the task of committing the Ladin oral heritage to writing has hardly begun and has entailed the usual political struggles of an endangered minority tongue. It is worth observing again, as mentioned, that the linguistic evidence reveals at least two dialects of Voynich Ms. There are many local dialects of Ladin, often confined to neighbouring valleys, and so we might suppose that the author struggled to capture and systemise this feature of rustic Ladin as well. We should acknowledge too that the paleographic evidence, although not convincing in itself in my opinion, suggests that a team of at least a few people worked on the manuscript. I speak of an author, singular, for convenience, but there are perhaps several minds working together on this project. I think the visual evidence and the organisation of the manuscript suggests that several distinct but related and compatible bodies of material, say herbal and astrological, have been consolidated into a single work. Different members of this team may have brought different linguistic skills to the project. The evidence of marginalia reveals German and Latin, but in my scenario this team of authors and scribes would be Ladiners, bilingual, cooperating to bring together and record their common traditions from the Ladin tongue. In any case, it is a private work for a small readership and clearly obeys its own in-house conventions. Moreover, an important but overlooked or hopelessly misconstrued consideration, it is evident that the alphabet and glyphs, and by extension the text written in them, is understood by their creator or creators to have gnostic or gnomic properties. The language itself is part of the cosmology. The language is not merely utilitarian, but also symbolic or sacred or magical, of pre-modern design in any case. I suspect that some of the more bizarre features to be observed in the Voynich text are the result of the author understanding the language to have esoteric properties, and such features might be extra-linguistic, and their nature is likely to evade the detection or understanding of modern linguists. Make no mistake, the herb-gathering traditions of the mountain Ladin, like their sagas and folklore, is replete with and inseparable from sorcery and magic. The problem of understanding a pre-modern cosmology is compounded by trying to understand equally pre-modern conceptions of language. There is no escaping the conclusion that the language on its own is a singularly extraordinary production, an outlier, and is unexpected. Whether transcription, code or conlang, magical or mundane, it is unusual, or is, as Courier described it, a mess. I think it is likely that some of the strangeness of Voynich Ms is the result not of genius, but of wild, rustic invention. What we have in the Voynich manuscript is the language of the nymphs, a wizard's Ladin. I'm aware of some linguistic evidence from the Voynich text that might support a Ladin scenario, and I'm very aware of other evidence that would seem to count against it. I'm not a linguist and have no means to test linguistic hypotheses, nor do I know what has happened to make the text the way it is. We are evidently missing an intermediate step in the language's transformations. I have no notion what. There has always been a body of opinion that detects Latin as the underlying language, but no one has demonstrated this with any statistical success any more than Arabic, Greek, Czech, Irish, Spanish, or Aztec. The study of the manuscript is littered with failed linguistic hypotheses. I have no doubt that Ladin, a remnant vulgar Latin isolate, would suffer the same fate by the same criteria if it has not been tested already. If I had the necessary linguistic skills, I would start by looking at Ladin toponyms, place names, in the relevant landscape as an alternative starting point. Among the Ladin tales, there is a celebrated story about an encounter between a water nymph and a wizard at Lake Carezza. I feel uncommonly certain that our strange manuscript pertains somehow, even if obliquely, to that particular story and whatever stories surround it. I am in any case confident that the materials depicted in the illustrations of the manuscript belong to or reflect the Ladin oral tradition and its landscape, and so I would be very surprised if the Ladin language, however transformed, is not in the background or somewhere in the reckoning. I personally doubt that Voynich Ms is a cipher or code, nor do I think it is gibberish. Therefore, it must be some admittedly bizarre transformation of a natural language. If the text matches the illustrations, then, I argue, the natural language is likely to be Ladin. The Voynich secondary literature is vast and uneven. I haven't been through it, but I would also be surprised if many of these points have not been made and perhaps gone over many times before. If they have, I think they are worth revisiting, because as far as I can tell, this is the right path towards shedding light upon this mysterious book. If we are looking for deeper contextual factors that may have been involved, it is noteworthy, I think, that throughout the relevant time period, 1400s, the relevant region, the South Tyrol, is undergoing a process of German settlement and linguistic Germanification that threatened and displaced the Ladin people, traditions and language. This might conceivably have supplied a context in which someone was motivated to commit a Ladin heritage departure. An even darker possibility is that the context is the arrival of the witch hunts, which begin in exactly this region, alpine northern Italy, around the 1460s. The Malleus Maleficarum was published in 1486 in Innsbruck, only 100 miles to the north, after its author Heinrich Kramer had been unsuccessful in prosecuting witches in the county Tyrol. There was an infamous episode in South Tyrol where 9 local herb women were accused of witchcraft and burned at the stake. That was the beginning of a very dark period. The Ladin country came to be perceived as witch-infested, and that is still presented in this way to tourists in our time. The tourist presentations are replete with witch kitsch. There is nothing in the Voynich manuscript obviously depicting an atmosphere of persecution, but it is nevertheless conceivable that it was the gathering tide of witch hysteria that caused someone or some group of people to bring this work into being. I personally suspect this might be the case. Its content, location and dating put it on the cusp of the witch hunts, and that is likely this is not unrelated. The Ladin people will tell you today that their folklore and mythology is indeed populated with witches, wizards, monsters and evil apparitions, but also they hasten to add a host of benign spirits such as the water nymphs, and benign characters such as herb women appointed by the mythic King Lauren to paint the Alpenglow of rosy health on the cheeks of the ailing. During the witch hunts, the witch hunters magnified the malignant side of this tradition. It hardened into our modern caricatures of the witch. The sociology of these outbreaks of persecution of rural women, which continued for centuries, but began in the Quattrocento, has been well studied. I propose that the benign side of the Ladin tradition, its herbalism, folk legends and healing magic, embedded as it was in a magical landscape, has, in some rendition, been preserved in the work we call the Voynich manuscript.